In a small, quiet town in Texas, life moved at a slow pace. The streets were lined with old oak trees, and the air carried the faint smell of barbecue from nearby diners. It was an ordinary day at the local elementary school, where kids filled the classrooms, chatting and laughing as they waited for the bell to ring. Among them was a boy named Tommy Jenkins. He wasn't the loudest or most popular kid in class. In fact, he often went unnoticed, sitting quietly at his desk while others took center stage. Today, however, Tommy had something special planned. It was show and tell day, a chance for students to bring in items from home and share stories about them. Most kids brought toys or drawings, but Tommy had something different. Clutched tightly in his hand was an old faded photograph. The edges were worn, and the colors had dulled over time, but it held immense value to him. The picture showed his grandfather standing next to none other than the President of the United States. Tommy's heart raced as he thought about sharing this with his classmates. He knew his grandfather was a remarkable man, someone who had lived a life full of adventures. His grandpa loved telling stories about his younger days, how he'd served in the military, traveled across the country, and even met some important people along the way. This particular photo was one of Tommy's favorites because it captured a moment when his grandfather stood proudly beside President Lyndon B. Johnson during a dinner at the president's ranch in Texas. When it was finally Tommy's turn to speak, he stood up hesitantly, clutching the photograph like it was a treasure map. His palms were sweaty, and his voice trembled as he began. Hi, he started, looking down at his shoes. The room grew quieter, and all eyes turned toward him. Taking a deep breath, he continued, "This is my grandpa. He once had dinner with the president." For a brief second, there was silence. Then, snickers erupted from a few corners of the classroom. Some kids exchanged glances, trying hard not to laugh outright. Others whispered sarcastic remarks under their breath. Tommy felt his cheeks burning red. He hadn't expected this reaction. All he wanted was to share something meaningful about his family, something that made him proud. But now, he just wanted to disappear. Mrs. Peterson, the teacher, leaned back, in her chair, arms crossed. She raised an eyebrow and gave Tommy a look that could only be described as disapproving. "Tommy," she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "that's quite the story. Do you really expect us to believe your grandpa dined with the president?" Her lips curled into a smirk. "Who is it? Chuck Norris?" The whole class burst into laughter. Even some of the quieter kids couldn't help but giggle at the absurdity of the idea. Chuck Norris, the legendary martial artist and actor known for his larger-than-life persona, dining with the president? It sounded ridiculous, and Mrs. Peterson clearly intended it as a joke to mock Tommy's claim. But for Tommy, it wasn't funny. He felt humiliated, like a spotlight had been shone on him for all the wrong reasons. His face flushed even redder, and he quickly sat back down, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The laughter echoed in his ears, making him wish he could rewind time and skip this entire moment. Little did anyone know, fate had other plans. Unbeknownst to the teacher and her students, a twist was coming, one that would leave everyone speechless, as The rest of the day dragged on. Tommy tried to shrink into the background, hoping no one would remember his failed attempt at show and tell. Meanwhile, outside the school building, a familiar figure walked through the front gates. Tall, rugged, and exuding confidence, he wore cowboy boots and a leather jacket that seemed straight out of a movie poster. No one inside the classroom realized it yet, but this stranger was about to change everything. For Tommy, for Mrs. Peterson, and for the entire class. What happened next would go down in the school's history, not just as a lesson learned, but as a reminder that sometimes truth is far more incredible than fiction. The laughter in the classroom had barely died down when a knock came at the door. Everyone turned their heads toward the sound. Curiosity piqued. Standing there was Principal Harris, a kind but no-nonsense man who rarely interrupted classes unless it was important. Behind him, however, stood someone unexpected, a tall, rugged figure with a confident stance and a warm smile. The stranger's cowboy boots clicked softly against the tiled floor as he stepped inside. "Mrs. Peterson," Principal Harris began, clearing his throat to get the teacher's attention, "we have a guest who would like to speak to your class, briefly." He gestured toward the man beside him. "Everyone, this is Chuck Norris." If the room had been buzzing before, it now erupted into chaos. Gasps filled the air as students leaned forward in their seats, eyes wide with disbelief. Was this the Chuck Norris? The martial arts legend, the actor, the guy whose name had become synonymous with strength and toughness? Some kids whispered excitedly to each other, while others simply stared, too stunned to speak. Mrs. Peterson, on the other hand, didn't seem nearly as impressed. She gave a polite nod, though her expression suggested she thought this might just be some local celebrity or impersonator trying to make an impression. "Of course, Mr. Norris," she replied coolly, gesturing for him to come in. "What brings you here?" Chuck Norris stepped further into the room, his presence commanding respect without him having to say a word. He scanned the classroom slowly, taking in the sea of curious faces. His gaze finally landed on Tommy, who sat frozen in his seat, still red-faced from earlier. Chuck smiled warmly, then turned back to address the group. "Well," he said in his deep, calm voice, "I heard there was a young man here today who mentioned his grandfather dining with the president. Is that true?" All eyes immediately shifted to Tommy once again. For the second time that day, he found himself at the center of everyone's attention, but this time it felt different. There was no mockery, no snickers, just genuine curiosity, mixed with awe. Encouraged by Chuck's friendly tone, Tommy hesitantly stood up, clutching the photograph tightly in his hand. He walked to the front of the classroom, feeling every pair of eyes on him. When he reached Chuck, he held out the picture, his hands trembling slightly. Chuck took it carefully, holding it up to examine it closely. As he studied the image, his expression changed from casual interest to unmistakable recognition. "Well, I'll be darned," Chuck said, breaking into a wide grin. "This is President Johnson, and if I'm not mistaken, this gentleman right here." He pointed to the man standing next to the president in the photo. "Is none other than Colonel James Jenkins." A hush fell over the room. No one dared to breathe as Chuck continued. "Colonel Jenkins served alongside me during my days in the military. We shared many meals together, including one memorable evening with President Lyndon B. Johnson at his ranch in Stonewall, Texas." You could hear a pin drop. Every student, and even Mrs. Peterson, was completely speechless. Tommy, meanwhile, felt a wave of emotions washing over him. Relief, pride, and disbelief all collided in his chest. He hadn't imagined anyone outside his family would recognize his grandfather, let alone someone as famous as Chuck Norris. Chuck handed the photograph back to Tommy, patting him gently on the shoulder. "Your grandpa was a great man," he said sincerely. "And from what I can see, you've got a lot of him in you." Tommy managed a small, shy smile, unsure of how to respond. The weight of the moment was almost overwhelming. Around him, his classmates exchanged glances, their earlier skepticism replaced by admiration. Even the kids who had laughed earlier now looked genuinely sorry for doubting him. But perhaps the most dramatic reaction came from Mrs. Peterson. Her face went pale as realization dawned on her. She glanced nervously between Chuck Norris and Tommy, clearly regretting her earlier words. Tommy," she stammered, her voice faltering. I didn't know. I shouldn't have doubted you." Her apology hung heavily in the air, but Tommy didn't say anything. Instead, he nodded silently, grateful that the truth had finally come to light. For the first time that day, he felt seen, not just by his classmates or his teacher, but by someone who truly understood the significance of his story. As the initial shock wore off, the students began whispering among themselves, eager to learn more about the legendary Colonel Jenkins and his connection to such iconic figures. Chuck Norris, sensing their enthusiasm, decided to stay a little longer. He pulled up a chair near the front of the room and started answering questions, sharing anecdotes about his time serving with Tommy's grandfather. He was a man of integrity, Chuck recalled fondly. Always put others first, whether it was his fellow soldiers or his family, and he had a sense of humor that could light up any room. The kids listened intently, hanging on to every word. They asked about everything, from Chuck's own experiences in the military to what it was like meeting the president. Each answer painted a vivid picture of a world far removed from their small Texas town, yet deeply connected to one of their own. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peterson sat quietly at her desk, watching the scene unfold. It was clear she was grappling with her mistake. Her earlier mockery seemed so petty now, especially in light of the extraordinary truth. She knew she needed to do better, not just for Tommy, but for all her students. Teaching wasn't just about facts and figures. It was about fostering trust, encouraging curiosity, and helping kids feel valued. When the bell finally rang, signaling the end of the school day, the classroom buzzed with excitement. Students gathered around Tommy, congratulating him and asking if they could see the photograph again. For the first time ever, Tommy felt like he belonged, not because of something flashy or trendy, but because he had shared a piece of his heart, and people had listened. As Chuck Norris prepared to leave, he shook hands with Principal Harris and thanked him for allowing him to visit. Before stepping out, he turned to Mrs. Peterson and offered her a reassuring smile. "We all make mistakes," he said kindly. "The important thing is learning from them. These kids look up to you. Don't underestimate the impact you can have on their lives." With that, he walked out of the classroom, leaving behind a trail of inspiration. Little did anyone know, his visit would spark changes that would ripple through the school and beyond for years to come. The next morning, the school buzzed with energy like never before. Word of Chuck Norris's visit had spread faster than wildfire, reaching not just the students but also parents, teachers, and even some local news outlets. By the time Tommy walked into his classroom, he was greeted with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Kids who usually ignored him now smiled warmly or gave him thumbs up as he passed by. It was strange yet comforting, a feeling he wasn't used to but quickly realized he liked. Mrs. Peterson, on the other hand, seemed unusually quiet. She stood at the front of the room, arranging papers on her desk, though it was clear her mind was elsewhere. When the bell rang and everyone settled into their seats, she cleared her throat and addressed the class. Her voice was softer than usual, almost hesitant. "Before we begin today's lesson," she started, "I want to say something." She paused, glancing briefly at Tommy before continuing. "Yesterday I made a mistake, a big one. I doubted someone when I shouldn't have, and I let my skepticism overshadow an important moment. That wasn't fair. To Tommy, to all of you, or to myself as your teacher." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment no one said anything. Then, slowly, a few kids nodded. They could tell she meant what she said. Mrs. Peterson went on, her tone growing firmer but still sincere. "Teaching isn't just about facts and figures. It's about listening, understanding, and encouraging each other to be our best selves. And yesterday, I failed at that. So, Tommy, I'm sorry for doubting you and for making you feel small when you were brave enough to share something meaningful." Tommy didn't know how to respond. Part of him wanted to brush it off, to pretend none of it mattered, but another part, the part that had carried the sting of embarrassment for so long, felt relieved. He gave her a small nod, which seemed to ease some of the tension in the room. The apology didn't erase everything, but it was a start. With that, Mrs. Peterson surprised everyone by announcing a new project. "Starting today," she said, "we're going to dedicate a bulletin board to remarkable stories from your family's histories. Each of you will have the chance to share something special about where you come from, whether it's a photograph, an heirloom, or just a story passed down through generations." She pointed to the empty bulletin board at the back of the classroom. "At its center," she added, "will be Tommy's photo of his grandfather with President Johnson. Because courage runs in the family and it deserves to be celebrated." The class erupted into applause, and Tommy felt his cheeks flush, not with embarrassment this time, but with pride. For the first time, he saw his story not as something to hide, but as something worth sharing. Over the next few days, the bulletin board came alive with colorful contributions. One student brought in a medal awarded to their great-grandfather for bravery during a war. Another shared a quilt stitched by their grandmother, each square telling a piece of their family's journey. Stories poured in, filling the classroom with a sense of connection and belonging. But the ripple effects of Chuck Norris's visit extended far beyond the walls of the school. Parents began talking among themselves, sharing tales they hadn't thought about in years. Some even visited the classroom to see the bulletin board, marveling at how such a simple idea had sparked so much interest. The local diner became a hub for storytelling, with older residents recounting memories of their own encounters with history, or humorously speculating about whether Chuck Norris might show up again. For Tommy, life changed in subtle but profound ways. He started standing a little taller, speaking a little louder, and smiling a little more often. His classmates treated him differently too, not because he was suddenly popular, but because they respected him. They saw him as someone who had dared to share something real, even when it felt risky. One afternoon after school, Tommy found himself lingering near the bulletin board. He traced the edges of his grandfather's photograph, lost in thought. Behind him, he heard footsteps approaching. Turning around, he saw Mrs. Peterson standing there holding a cup of coffee from the staff lounge. "I just wanted to say thank you," she said softly. "You reminded me why I became a teacher in the first place, to help kids like you find their voice. Yesterday I failed at that, but today I'm grateful for the chance to do better." Tommy blinked, surprised by her honesty. "It's okay," he replied, shrugging slightly. "I guess mistakes happen." She smiled, nodding. "They do, but it's what we learn from them that matters." As she walked away, Tommy couldn't help but feel a newfound respect for her. Maybe people weren't perfect, but they could grow, and that was something worth celebrating. Later that week, Principal Harris called Tommy into his office. At first, Tommy worried he was in trouble, but the principal quickly put him at ease. "Son," he said, leaning back in his chair, "you've done something extraordinary here. Your story has inspired not just your classmates, but the entire community. People are starting to realize how much we can learn from each other if we take the time to listen." He handed Tommy a small trophy engraved with the words, "Courage runs in the family." "This is for you," he said, "not because of who your grandfather was, but because of who you are." Tommy accepted the trophy, his hands trembling slightly. He didn't consider himself courageous, but maybe courage wasn't always about grand gestures. Maybe it was about standing up, even quietly, for what mattered most. By the end of the month, the impact of Chuck Norris's visit had woven itself into the fabric of the town. Families gathered to swap stories, schools across the district adopted similar projects, and even the local newspaper ran a feature on the power of storytelling. Through it all, Tommy remained humble, knowing that his grandfather's legacy was bigger than any single moment. And whenever doubt crept in, whether from others or from within himself, Tommy would remember those simple, powerful words. You never know. Maybe Chuck Norris will walk in. As the weeks went by, the buzz around Tommy's story didn't fade. It grew. The bulletin board that had started as a small classroom project became the centerpiece of the school's hallway, drawing visitors from other classes and even neighboring schools. Parents stopped by during pickup times to admire the colorful display, pointing out photos and mementos while sharing their own memories with their kids. What began as a lesson in history turned into something much bigger, a celebration of identity, heritage, and the invisible threads that connected everyone. Tommy, who once shrank into the background, found himself at the heart of it all. Kids from older grades approached him in the cafeteria, asking if he could tell them more about his grandfather. Some teachers invited him to speak briefly in their classrooms, eager for their students to hear firsthand how one moment of courage could inspire so many. At first, Tommy felt nervous about being in the spotlight again, but with each retelling of his story, he grew more confident. He realized that people weren't just curious about his grandfather. They were curious about him. They wanted to know what it felt like to stand up and share something personal, even when it seemed risky. One day, after giving a short talk to a group of sixth graders, Tommy was walking back to his classroom when he overheard two boys talking near the water fountain. "Man, I wish my grandpa did something cool like that," one of them said wistfully. His friend replied, "Maybe yours did. You just don't know yet." Something about those words stuck with Tommy. It made him think about how easy it was to overlook the stories hiding in plain sight, waiting to be discovered. That evening, Tommy sat at the kitchen table with his mom, flipping through an old photo album she'd pulled down from the top shelf of the closet. Between faded snapshots of birthday parties and family vacations were pictures of his grandfather in uniform, standing tall beside fellow soldiers. There were letters, too, handwritten notes on yellowed paper, filled with stories of camaraderie and sacrifice. As his mom read some of them aloud, Tommy felt a deep sense of pride, not just for his grandfather, but for his entire family. These weren't just pieces of memorabilia. They were fragments of a legacy that shaped who he was today. The next morning, Tommy decided to take things a step further. During show and tell, instead of simply showing the photograph again, he brought the album along with him. When it was his turn, he opened it carefully and began sharing snippets of his grandfather's life, the challenges he faced, the friendships he forged, and the values he lived by. The class listened intently, captivated not just by the tales of bravery, but by the humanity behind them. By the end, several students asked if they could borrow the album to look at during recess. For the first time, Tommy felt like he wasn't just telling a story. He was building a bridge between generations. Meanwhile, Mrs. Peterson continued to make changes in her teaching style. She started incorporating more storytelling into her lessons, encouraging students to connect historical events to their own lives. In social studies class, for example, she assigned a project where each student researched a significant event from their family's past and presented it to the class. Some dug into immigration stories, tracing their ancestors' journeys across oceans. Others explored cultural traditions, explaining how recipes or rituals had been passed down through the years. Each presentation added another layer to the tapestry of shared experiences, reminding everyone that no matter how different their backgrounds might seem, they all carried pieces of history within them. But perhaps the most surprising transformation came from Tommy himself. Before the incident with the photograph, he had always seen himself as ordinary, someone who blended into the crowd without making waves. Now he realized that being ordinary wasn't such a bad thing. Ordinary people told extraordinary stories. Ordinary people kept traditions alive. And ordinary people like him had the power to spark change simply by being brave enough to share a piece of themselves. One Friday afternoon, the school held a special assembly to honor the success of the bulletin board project. Parents packed the auditorium, sitting shoulder to shoulder as Principal Harris took the stage. After thanking everyone for their participation, he called Tommy up to join him. The room erupted into applause as Tommy walked onto the stage, clutching the trophy Principal Harris had given him earlier. Tommy reminded us all of something very important, Principal Harris said, his voice echoing through the hall. He reminded us that our stories matter, not because they're perfect, but because they're ours. They remind us where we come from, help us understand who we are, and guide us toward who we can become. When it was Tommy's turn to speak, he hesitated for a moment, gripping the microphone tightly. Then he took a deep breath and began. "I never thought anyone would care about my grandpa's picture," he admitted, looking out at the sea of faces. "But then I learned that it's not just about the picture, it's about the person in it. My grandpa taught me that it's okay to be proud of who you are and where you come from. And now, thanks to all of you, I know I'm not alone in feeling that way." His words earned another round of applause, louder this time. As he stepped off the stage, he noticed Mrs. Peterson wiping away tears, her face glowing with pride. Even Principal Harris gave him a pat on the back, whispering, "You've done your grandpa proud." In the days that followed, the ripple effects of the assembly spread throughout the town. Local businesses got involved, hosting story nights, where residents gathered to swap tales over coffee and pie. A nearby library launched a program called Family Treasures, inviting families to bring in heirlooms and documents to preserve their histories digitally. Everywhere Tommy looked, people were finding ways to celebrate their roots, and it all traced back to that one photograph. Still, there were moments when doubt crept in. Sometimes, when kids teased each other on the playground or teachers seemed impatient during lessons, Tommy wondered if the lessons they'd learned would stick. Would people remember to listen? Would they keep valuing each other's stories? Those questions lingered in his mind until one rainy afternoon when he spotted a familiar figure walking through the school gates. It was Chuck Norris. Tommy froze, unsure if he was imagining things. But sure enough, the martial arts legend strode confidently toward the entrance, shaking hands with students and staff alike. When he reached Tommy, he knelt down to his level, just like he had before, and smiled. "How's it going, champ?" he asked warmly. It's good," Tommy stammered, still in shock. "What are you doing here?" Chuck chuckled. "I heard this school has been doing some amazing work lately. Thought I'd stop by to see it for myself." As word spread that Chuck Norris was back, the entire school gathered in the gym for an impromptu Q&A session. Kids lined up to ask questions ranging from silly, "Can you really roundhouse kick the moon?" to serious, "What's the bravest thing you've ever done?" Through it all, Chuck remained patient and kind, using every opportunity to reinforce the importance of kindness, humility, and believing in oneself. Before leaving, he pulled Tommy aside once more. "You've inspired a lot of people, kid," he said. "Don't ever forget that." Tommy nodded, feeling a lump rise in his throat. He didn't feel like a hero. In fact, he still saw himself as just a regular boy. But maybe that was the point. Maybe heroes weren't defined by their strength or fame, but by the quiet ways they touched others' lives. And as Chuck Norris walked out of the school for the second time, Tommy knew one thing for certain. Courage wasn't about never being afraid. It was about facing your fears anyway and trusting that sometimes the world would meet you halfway. The days following Chuck Norris's second visit felt like a whirlwind for Tommy and everyone else at the school. The energy was electric, as if the entire community had been infused with a renewed sense of purpose. People weren't just talking about what had happened. They were acting on it. Conversations that once revolved around sports scores or weekend plans now centered around family stories, traditions, and shared histories. It was as though a hidden door had been opened, revealing treasures no one realized were there all along. For Tommy, life had taken on a rhythm he never expected. He went from being the quiet kid in the corner to someone others looked up to, not because he sought attention, but because his actions spoke louder than words. Kids who used to tease him for being shy now approached him with genuine curiosity, asking questions about his grandfather and how he stayed so calm during tough moments. Teachers started calling him the storyteller, often asking him to share snippets of his family's history during class discussions. Even strangers in town recognized him when he walked by, giving him friendly nods or stopping to chat. One Saturday morning, Tommy accompanied his mom to the local farmers market. As they browsed through stalls piled high with fresh produce and homemade goods, several vendors greeted them warmly. One elderly woman selling jars of honey leaned over her table and said, "You're Tommy, aren't you? The boy with the grandpa who dined with the president?" Tommy nodded, smiling politely. The woman beamed back. "My grandson came home last week talking nonstop about your story. Said it made him want to ask me more about our own family. So, thank you for reminding us that these stories matter." That simple exchange stayed with Tommy long after they left the market. It wasn't just about pride or recognition, it was about connection. Every time someone mentioned his grandfather's name, it felt like a thread tying him closer to the world around him. And every time someone shared their own story in return, it reminded him that everyone carried something valuable inside them. Something worth sharing. Back at school, the momentum showed no signs of slowing down. Mrs. Peterson had become a champion of storytelling, weaving it into nearly every subject she taught. In science class, she encouraged students to research famous inventors or scientists from their cultural backgrounds. In art, she asked them to create pieces inspired by family heirlooms or traditions. Even math lessons found ways to incorporate real-life examples like calculating distances traveled by ancestors migrating to new lands. Her efforts didn't go unnoticed. Parents began praising her approach, saying it helped their children see learning as more than just textbooks and tests. One father wrote a letter to the principal, thanking Mrs. Peterson for helping his son discover a love for history. Another parent stopped by after school to express gratitude for sparking conversations at home that hadn't happened in years. Slowly, but surely, Mrs. Peterson transformed from the strict teacher who mocked Tommy into a mentor beloved by her, students, and herself. But perhaps the most profound change occurred within Tommy himself. Before this journey began, he'd always doubted whether his voice mattered. Now, he understood that courage wasn't about being fearless. It was about stepping forward despite fear. It was about trusting that your story, no matter how small it seemed, could resonate with others in ways you couldn't predict. One afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting golden light across the playground, Tommy sat on a bench, watching his classmates play. A younger boy wandered over, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Hey," the boy said hesitantly, "can I show you something?" Tommy nodded, curious. The boy unfolded the paper carefully, revealing a drawing of two figures standing side by side. One tall and strong, the other smaller but equally proud. "This is my dad," the boy explained, pointing to the taller figure. "He works really hard fixing cars. My mom says he's a hero because he takes care of us." Tommy studied the picture, feeling a lump rise in his throat. "That's awesome," he said sincerely. "Your dad sounds like a great guy." The boy grinned, clearly pleased. "Do you think maybe I could put this on the bulletin board, too?" "Absolutely," Tommy replied without hesitation. "It belongs there." As the boy ran off to find Mrs. Peterson, Tommy sat back, reflecting on how far things had come. What started as a single photograph had grown into a movement, a reminder that everyone's story deserved to be heard. And while not every tale involved presidents or celebrities, each one carried weight, meaning, and heart. Later that week, the school hosted its annual talent show. Students practiced songs, dances, and skits, eager to showcase their skills. But this year, something different happened. Several kids chose to perform spoken-word pieces based on their family stories. One girl recited a poem about her grandmother's journey immigrating to America, her voice trembling with emotion. Another boy acted out a monologue imagining what his great-uncle might have felt serving in the military. Each performance drew thunderous applause, leaving audience members wiping away tears. When it was Tommy's turn, he stepped onto the stage holding a framed copy of his grandfather's photograph. Instead of speaking, he simply held it up for everyone to see. Then, in a clear, steady voice, he said, "This is my grandpa. He taught me that courage isn't about doing big things, it's about staying true to yourself, even when it's hard. And that's something we can all do." The room erupted into cheers, louder and longer than any other act that night. For Tommy, it wasn't about the applause. It was about knowing he'd played a part in creating a space where people felt safe to share their truths. By the end of the school year, the impact of everything that had happened was undeniable. The bulletin board project had expanded beyond the classroom, inspiring similar initiatives in schools across the district. Local businesses donated funds to create a community archive where families could preserve their stories digitally. Even, the mayor declared a storytelling day, encouraging residents to spend time connecting with loved ones and documenting their legacies. Through it all, Tommy remained humble, aware that none of this would have happened without the support of those around him. His grandfather's photograph still hung proudly at the center of the bulletin board, surrounded by countless other mementos and tales. Together they formed a mosaic of humanity, a testament to the power of sharing who we are. As summer break approached, Tommy stood in front of the bulletin board one last time before heading home. He traced the edges of his grandfather's photo, whispering a silent thank you. Then he turned and walked away, ready to embrace whatever adventures lay ahead. Because now, he knew, wherever he went, his story would go with him, and it would always find a way to connect with others, and deep down he couldn't wait to see what happened next. Summer arrived, bringing with it the lazy warmth of long days and endless possibilities. For Tommy, this summer felt different from any other. The school year had ended on such a high note that he carried its energy with him like a secret treasure, Everywhere he went, people seemed to notice the change in him. Neighbors waved more warmly, shopkeepers greeted him by name, and even kids who used to ignore him now sought him out at the park. It wasn't fame or popularity, it was connection. Tommy realized that when you shared something real about yourself, it gave others permission to do the same. One sunny afternoon, Tommy decided to visit his grandmother's house. She lived just a few blocks away, in a cozy little home filled with knickknacks and framed photographs lining every wall. His grandmother loved telling stories almost as much as his grandfather had, and today, Tommy wanted to hear them all over again. He knocked on her door, holding a notebook he'd borrowed from his mom. Inside, he planned to jot down details about his family's history, things he might have missed before but now felt important to remember. "Tommy," his grandmother exclaimed, opening the door with a wide smile. "What brings you here?" "I thought maybe we could talk about Grandpa," Tommy said shyly, holding up the notebook. "I want to write down some of his stories." Her eyes softened and she ushered him inside. They settled into the living room, surrounded by shelves crammed with books and photo albums. As they flipped through pages yellowed with age, his grandmother recounted tales Tommy had heard dozens of times, but now they struck him differently. Each anecdote painted a fuller picture of the man his grandfather had been. Kind yet firm, adventurous yet grounded, proud of his roots but always looking toward the future. He loved meeting new people, his grandmother said wistfully, pointing to a picture of him shaking hands with a group of soldiers. He believed everyone had a story worth hearing. That's why he never hesitated to sit down with someone, even strangers, and ask them about their lives. Tommy nodded thoughtfully. He could see traces of that philosophy in himself now. Sharing his grandfather's photograph hadn't just been about proving Mrs. Peterson wrong, it had been about honoring his grandfather's legacy, a legacy built on listening, learning, and connecting. After spending hours with his grandmother, Tommy left her house feeling lighter, as if he'd unearthed pieces of himself he hadn't known were missing. On the way home, he stopped by the library to return a book he'd borrowed earlier in the week. Inside, he noticed a flyer pinned to the bulletin board near the entrance. It advertised an upcoming event called Community Story Night, inviting residents to gather and share personal anecdotes, poems, or songs inspired by their families. At the bottom of the flyer in bold letters it read, "Inspired by our local school's storytelling projects." Tommy smiled to himself. The ripple effects of what had started in his classroom kept spreading, touching lives far beyond anything he'd imagined. He made a mental note to attend the event with his mom, knowing his grandmother would love to join too. The weeks flew by, and soon it was time for Community Story Night. Families packed the town hall, filling rows of chairs arranged in neat semicircles. A makeshift stage stood at the front, adorned with strings of fairy lights that twinkled softly against the darkened room. Tommy sat between his mom and grandmother, clutching a glass of lemonade as they waited for the program to begin. When the host stepped onto the stage, a local teacher who had collaborated closely with Mrs. Peterson, he thanked everyone for coming and explained the evening's theme. "Tonight," he said, "we celebrate the power of stories to bring us together. Whether your tale is funny, sad, or somewhere in between, remember this. Every word you share helps build bridges between hearts." One by one, people took the stage, sharing snippets of their lives. A teenager read a heartfelt letter to her late father, describing how his lessons shaped her dreams. An elderly man sang a folk song passed down through generations, his voice cracking slightly, but full of emotion. A young mother told the story of immigrating to the United States, recounting both the struggles and joys of building a new life. Then it was Tommy's turn. Nervously, he climbed the steps to the stage, gripping the microphone tightly. The crowd fell silent, waiting expectantly. Taking a deep breath, he began. "Hi, everyone. My name is Tommy, and I'm here to tell you about my grandpa." He held up the framed photograph, letting the spotlight catch its edges. "This picture shows my grandpa standing next to President Lyndon B. Johnson. But to me, it represents so much more than just a meal with a famous person. It reminds me of the values my grandpa lived by. courage, kindness, and curiosity about the world around him. As Tommy spoke, he recounted not only the story behind the photograph, but also everything that had happened since he first brought it to class. He talked about the laughter, the doubt, the apology, and the unexpected appearance of Chuck Norris. He described how those events sparked a chain reaction, inspiring others to dig deeper into their own histories and find meaning in their roots. By the time he finished, the room erupted into applause. People stood clapping and cheering, their faces glowing with admiration. Tommy stepped off the stage, overwhelmed but grateful. His mom hugged him tightly, tears streaming down her cheeks, while his grandmother patted his back and whispered, "Your grandpa would be so proud." That night marked a turning point, not just for Tommy, but for the entire community. Over the following month, similar events popped up in neighboring towns, each one drawing larger crowds than the last. Schools incorporated storytelling workshops into their curriculums. Libraries hosted regular sessions where elders shared oral histories, and even local businesses encouraged employees to swap tales during lunch breaks. What had begun as a single child's act of bravery blossomed into a cultural movement, reminding everyone of the importance of preserving and sharing their legacies. For Tommy, life continued to unfold in ways he couldn't have predicted. He entered middle school the next fall, carrying with him the lessons he'd learned, that courage comes in many forms, that vulnerability can lead to connection, and that every person has a story worth telling. Though he no longer carried the Paul Trophy Principal Harris had given him, its message remained etched in his heart. Courage runs in the family. Years later, as an adult, Tommy often reflected on that pivotal moment in 5th grade. By then, he'd become a teacher himself, using storytelling as a cornerstone of his teaching philosophy. In his classroom, there was always a designated space for students to display items representing their heritage, a modern version of the bulletin board project that had changed his life. And whenever doubts crept in, whether from students, colleagues, or even himself, he remembered the words that had guided him through tough times. "You never know. Maybe Chuck Norris will walk in." It wasn't about hoping for miracles, it was about believing in the extraordinary potential hidden within ordinary moments, because sometimes all it takes is one brave step to set off a chain reaction that changes everything, for yourself, for others, and for generations to come.